is the end of an era here at the North Carolina Medical Board. Our longtime leader, David Henderson, announced a few months ago that he is retiring after 26 years with the organization, 20 of those as its top executive. This is Jean Fisher Brinkley, Communications Director for the North Carolina Medical Board, and this is MedBoard Matters. Thank you for joining me. On this episode, we say goodbye to Mr. Henderson and reflect on some of the things the board achieved under his watch. During his time as CEO, Mr. Henderson has led the organization through a lot of changes, and he has consistently positioned NCMB as a leader. North Carolinians may not realize it, but this board is looked to as a standard bearer among medical regulators nationally in the areas of transparency, licensee information, technology, outreach and education, addressing sexual misconduct by licensees, and much more. Now, David Henderson is a humble guy, and he would no doubt have preferred to ride off into the sunset without fanfare. But we couldn't let him do that. It took a little bit of arm twisting, but I was able to persuade David to discuss some of the highlights of his tenure. When I told him it would be good for the board, as well as for licensees and the public, to learn about some of the many positive things that have occurred over the last 2 decades, he finally consented. He just needed to know that it wasn't going to be all about him. David, thank you so much for joining me for the podcast.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
I wanted to ask you to start just at the beginning by telling us your story. You have spent most of your professional career working in regulation, and I wondered if you could talk about how that happened. How did you get into this field?
Well, it probably starts with my parents. They were state employees for many, many years. They worked for the School for the Deaf in Morganton, and I saw, firsthand the value of public service type work. And so that was, I guess, one piece of it. The other piece of it is I just have always appreciated the importance of rules in our lives and the importance of people, following rules. And so I was just sort of been naturally attracted to that kind of work. And when I was in school at UNC Charlotte, I was the Deputy Attorney General there and responsible for handling student code violations. And then after college, I went to work for the Office of Child Daycare Licensing, which is the state agency that enforces and manages the regulations related to licensed daycare centers. I loved that work. That was great. And then after law school and a few years in private practice, went to work at the North Carolina State Bar, which is the state agency that regulates the practice of law in North Carolina. I really enjoyed that work. And then in 1996, I learned of an opening at the North Carolina Medical Board and applied and was hired as one of the staff attorneys. And then, of course, later on became executive director and then CEO. So, yeah, just always been attracted to this kind of work. And I'm a big believer in enforcement, licensing, and regulation, but I also think it ought to be done in a responsible way. Some people call that right touch regulation. Public protection always comes first, but I think it's important to do that in a way that's fair to our licensees.
Okay. You don't often hear people say, I like rules and I like regulation. Could you say just a little bit more about that and sort of what you mean? Why is it necessary for us to have rules, specifically in the context, I guess, of professional regulation?
Yeah, well, so, all of us have different ideas about the role of government in our lives. Some think that the government's too involved. Some think they need to be more involved. But most people would agree that there's a unique role for government as far as the health, safety, and welfare of the people of the state in North Carolina. So it's the legislature's job on behalf of the public whenever they determine that there's some activity that could pose potential harm to the people of North Carolina to set up laws and rules to protect the public. And so back in 1859, the legislature determined that the practice of medicine could be hazardous to the public if not performed by people who have the skills and knowledge to be able to do that safely. And so they created the medical board, turned that over to the profession to regulate that. And so that's what we do is we make sure that folks meet the high standards that we have here in North Carolina for practicing medicine. And then once they get a license, they fail to meet those standards, and it's our job to step in on behalf of the public to take appropriate action.
Okay. Now, you mentioned you first came to the medical board in 1996. I believe it was as a staff attorney. Is that right?
Correct.
Yep. And I think you were in that role 6 years. Is that correct? Before you took over
6 years. Yep.
5 or 6 years, and you became executive director. And then
Correct.
later, your title changed to CEO, and 26 years service in total, if I'm
That's correct.
doing the math right. Not
That's
my strongest subject, but 26 years.
Yes.
And, the board, I can only imagine, I've been here for 15 of those years, but the board has changed tremendously in that time in just how it gets the work done. And I wondered if you could just think back to how things were when you started and describe how the work was done then and how some things have changed.
Well, a lot has changed, that's for sure. When I first arrived there, just thinking about board meetings, I remember that we were meeting every month back then. Right now, we meet every other month. But every month, we would go to this large room where a lot of tables were set up, and these huge 3-ring binder notebooks were set up in there with tabs. And different staff had different responsibilities for different tabs. And you were required to print 12 copies of your materials and go on a particular day, go into that room and put your materials behind that tab. And at the end of the day, everything was in there. And those things must have weighed, 10 pounds or something. They were huge. And then we would go about shipping those notebooks out to the board members a couple weeks in advance of the meeting, and they would be required to review all that prior to the meeting and tote those huge notebooks in with them and carry those with them throughout the meeting. So that was one thing that was a lot different than how we do it now.
Right. Now everything is digital, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So now, in that regard, what we do now is all the board meeting materials are uploaded to an FTP site, and we let the board members know that they're ready to be downloaded, and they're downloaded to some custom board meeting software that we have loaded onto their board-issued laptops. So we still have tabs that help organize the materials, but they're electronic tabs. And no shipping of huge notebooks and that sort of thing.
Right. Now, I think you're about to say something about licensing.
Yeah. So licensing is another area where we've really changed. Back in 1996, all that was done by paper and by mail. So it was a much slower process. Also, every person who applied to get a license to practice in North Carolina had to be interviewed, either by a current board member or a former board member. And it didn't matter where you lived. You could be in Timbuktu. If you wanted to get a license, you had to travel to North Carolina and meet face-to-face, with either a current or former board member. And so fast forward to today, most, if not all, of our license application work is online, and we no longer require the in-person interviews. Most applications are processed by staff if there are no issues with the application. So the board has delegated the authority to staff to issue a license without board involvement in those cases. If there are some issues, the board members have the ability to interview those applicants, but all that's done now by teleconference. We don't have in-person interviews anymore. So what that means for us and for the applicants is that it's a much more efficient process, and in most cases, a much quicker process.
Right. In some ways, it seems to me that you really have ushered the medical board into the modern era, into the 21st century, if you will.
Well, a lot of it is just taking advantage of the technology that was available to us. And so we obviously weren't the only organization utilizing technology to do things more effectively and more efficiently. So we were keeping up with everything else that was going on. I'll just mention one other thing. The renewals. Every year, physicians and PAs are required to renew their license. And again, I remember when I first arrived in 96, back then the renewals were done one time a year, not throughout the year like we do now on the licensee's birthday. So once a year, calendar year thing. I remember in December, again, with this big room, tables spread out all over the place, stacks of renewal forms. It was all done by paper. They would fill out the renewal forms. They'd send that in with their check. And so, 26 different stacks for all the different letters of the alphabet spread out throughout the room. And so once those came in, we'd have to deposit the checks. I remember, bundling up checks and those deposit bags. You'd put the checks in and take them over to the bank and put them in the deposit place there at the bank. And then, manually enter into our system, all the information that was on the renewal form. So just think about all the, time. We have over 50,000 licensees now. Just think about having to do that.
Oh, my goodness.
So.
Right. Now, I imagine licensee population was considerably less. I know from the work that I do that the total licensee population has been increasing at a rate of about 2%, pretty steadily in the last 10, 15 years. I don't know if that's been consistent, but still, even if it was 20,000, 25,000, that's a lot of paper to push.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so now, again, it's all online. Each licensee has their own access to their portal on our website. We notify them by email that it's time to renew. They go online, they use a credit card, they input the information. And so whatever information they put in is automatically transported into our system. So there's no issue of data entry problems, or the time and effort involved in that. So it's again, much quicker, easier process, I think, both for the licensee and for medical board staff.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about change, but, really more in the how the work gets done. I know you care a lot about customer service.
Correct.
And you've set a tone from the top that just because this organization is a regulatory body, that does not mean, some people say, oh, well, you have a monopoly. Your clients, i.e. the licensed medical professionals of the state, have to do business with you. So you don't have to have good customer service. You disagree with that. Can you talk with me about what your philosophy is about customer service and how you've tried to encourage good customer service throughout your tenure?
Yeah, so it is something that I'm really proud of that we've been able to sort of implement here at the board. And we talk a lot about it's not just what we do, but how we go about doing it. So the what of it is we want to be skilled and professional and be experts in whatever it is we're doing. But above and beyond that, we want to focus on how it is we go about doing our business. And with all our different customers, and we have lots of different customers. Obviously, the public, is a very important customer of ours, and how we deal with the public is important. But our licensees are also customers of ours. Those of us on the staff, the board members are our customers. We want to make sure that we go out and get all the information they need to make an informed decision. We want to provide them with our professional recommendation as to what we think is the right way to go in a particular case. And then afterwards, we want to execute, on the decisions that they make. So board members are important. Our stakeholder organizations, they're important customers of ours. So lots of different groups out there that we interact with. And it just makes my day when we get emails from satisfied customers, whether they're licensees, maybe applicants, maybe members of the public who are writing in and just complimenting our staff on, again, not just what they did. They were able to fulfill the assignment, but the way they went about it, exceeding expectations with how they went about it. So it's that's something that's important to me, and I'm glad we've been able to make some progress with that.
Yeah, and I don't know if I have ever told you this, but in communications, we definitely take that charge seriously. And, we sometimes will talk internally within the department that a lot of times when people reach out to us, especially members of the public, they're already unhappy. They've had something go wrong with their medical care. They're not pleased with their physician or their physician assistant. Sometimes these folks have called around to various organizations and not been successful in addressing whatever issue they have. So when people get to us, sometimes they're already frustrated, they're already angry, and we sort of take it upon ourselves to try to give that person a good customer service experience with the board, even if we can't ultimately solve their problem. So I think we take it very seriously, and I know others who work for the board do as well.
I've said before, in some ways we're set up for success because of the fact that we are a state agency. Sometimes expectations are already pretty low as far as what people expect from us. And they're shocked when they make a phone call and somebody actually picks up the phone, and answers, or other things little things that we do to show our customers that we care about the experience they have with the board. So it's nice to surprise people in that way.
I agree completely. Another thing that I had wanted to ask you about that I would say is a theme of your leadership has been being more than just our mission. And when I say that, our mission is extremely important. I know you believe in it. I believe in it. Very, very important indeed, which is to protect the public through just and vigilant licensing and regulation. There's our mission statement for you. But at the same time, I think that you have always encouraged the staff and the board to think big and to not just say, well, licensing and regulation is our job. That's all we're going to do. I think you've also always set the tone that if we can reach past that, if we can do more, that we should. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of where that idea comes from and what motivates you in that regard?
Right. Well, that is important. And I think we're set up for success here. We've got a really supportive board. We've got just a great group of dedicated public servants here on the staff. And then we're adequately resourced. So if you put those three things together, I think a lot of really good things can happen. And you're right, we've got to get the basics down first and foremost, the licensing and the regulation of the profession. Those are our core responsibilities. But several years ago, we figured, well, we're doing pretty well in this area. Can we do more as far as doing some strategic planning and some visioning? And so you look at our vision statement, which is to be proactive and progressive leader that addresses emerging challenges of medicine. So that's what we've tried to do, is just create a situation here on our staff where we have a group of chiefs who are more focused on the strategic piece of it, the visioning piece of it. And then we have our managers who are very important as far as executing on the vision and making sure that the work gets done the way we want to get work done. And then again, a very supportive board that is also innovative, progressive. They want to help support that work.
And I think it's probably worth noting just that the board didn't always have a vision statement. That was something that came out of discussions that were happening at the highest level of the organization with the board members. And it was decided that the board should have a vision statement. And it is what you just indicated. Since that vision statement was created 2015, 2016,
right.
I think we're doing it. And, I invite you to talk about some of the things for yourself, thinking back. How is this organization realizing that vision? What ways has this board been able to be progressive and proactive in the work that it does?
Well, a few things come to mind. We've already mentioned the customer service piece of it. I think that distinguishes us from a lot of other agencies in the state and the country, and we're proud of that. Supporting the profession, that's important to us. We think that there's a connection there between public protection and supporting the profession. So we're not just lying in wait until one of our licensees does something wrong and then pouncing on them. We want to, if we can, try and support our licensees and help keep them out of trouble. So that's being proactive and progressive, and again, trying to prevent there being any problems with our licensees. So I would say that connected with that is our data strategy program. We recently waded into that sort of work and asking questions like, are board actions effective or not? If they're not effective, then we shouldn't be doing it. So, intuitively, we hope that actions that we take are going to make a difference and are going to help protect the public, but we need the data to be able to tell us one way or the other on that. And then also, what are some characteristics, traits, of our licensees that with the data that indicate that they're more prone, maybe to certain problems in certain areas? Let's figure that out. And then let's do some focused training, education for those folks in those areas. So again, trying to head these things off the pass before we have problems.
And the project that you're talking about, trying to have a data strategy, use data to inform the regulatory decisions that the board makes, our board is a leader in that area. And it seems as good a time as any to remark that North Carolina listeners may not realize, but our board is viewed nationally as a leader among medical regulatory authorities, is often looked to, for, hey, what's North Carolina doing with regard to professional sexual misconduct or transparency and licensing information, which is dear to my heart. Can you talk a little bit about how that came to be? How did North Carolina get active on the national stage? And at what point did you start hearing, well, North Carolina is really a leader? How did that develop?
Again, I think it's first of all, sort of our ecosystem, like I talked about before. We've always have had a strong board, a supportive board, a board that wanted to be progressive and proactive. So that's number one. And the staff, again, as I mentioned, we've got a wonderful, dedicated, hardworking staff that's, again, the mindset is how can we do things better? And then the resources, we are fortunate to have the resources. But you can have all the ideas in the world, great ideas in the world, but if you're not resourced sufficiently to do that, then it's just going to be frustrating. So that's number one. Number two is we've always been involved with the national group, the Federation of State Medical Boards, and we've had folks on that board. We've had folks who've been chair of that organization. And so I think with that involvement and involvement in other committees and work groups, we've been able to learn what's going on a national level, bring that back to North Carolina and build on that. So I think that's been an important piece of it.
Okay, great. One of the things that we know in communications, because we have done public surveys, we've done licensee surveys, one of the things that we know about the public specifically is that a lot of folks just simply are not aware of the medical board. We don't have great familiarity. Others are aware of us, but don't really understand what we do. So I'm curious, what would you say is the greatest misconception that members of the public hold about the medical board?
Probably the biggest misconception is that the board is not doing its job like it should be doing its job. First of all, most of the public don't know that we even exist. So
Yeah.
we're talking about, when you say the public, we're talking about people who've had some interaction with the board, likely because they filed a complaint with the board and they feel like the physician has done something wrong. And then at the end of the process, the result is not what the complainant had hoped for. So sometimes it's because the board just doesn't have the authority to take action because of our Medical Practice Act and some limitations there. Sometimes the board has taken private remedial action, which is appropriate in that particular case, but the complainant is not aware of all the details of that. But if it's something less than a public action, then the complainant is probably going to be disappointed, because of the fact that it's a profession-led regulation. We have 13 board members, and 10 of those are either physicians or a PA or a nurse practitioner. But because it is a profession-led regulation or self-regulation, then it's the old adage about the fox guarding the hen house. And people think that the healthcare professionals just protecting their colleagues who are in the profession. But I can tell you, and Gene, I know you know this as well, having watched the board operate over many, many years, that just is simply not true, that they take their responsibility, public protection mandate and responsibility very seriously, and that when it's necessary to impose public action, either because there's been repeat violations where the licensee is either unable or unwilling to comply with the board's directives, or it might be a single, egregious case of either substandard care or misconduct, the board will take appropriate action up to including suspension or revocation of the license.
Right. It is a constant challenge, but yeah, I'd have to agree. Same question for licensees. What do you think is the biggest misconception licensees have about the medical board?
Well, again, for licensees, I mean, they're going to apply for a license. They're going to get a license. They're going to renew their license once a year. Other than that, the only contact they're going to have with the board is if a complaint is filed against them. And I think it's frustrating for licensees when a complaint is filed against them because they believe that it's a frivolous complaint. There's no merit to it. They don't understand why the board is investigating a complaint that they believe is clearly frivolous. And that's frustrating for them. And they believe the board is just out to get them. So we don't initiate these things on our own. These investigations are open as the result of some report that's made to us. And we have frankly have an obligation to follow up on every complaint. I tell people, just like it's a privilege to practice medicine, it's also a privilege to self-regulate. And the legislature gave the profession the responsibility of regulating the practice of medicine back in 1859, and they can take it away, from the profession just as well. So it's in everyone's best interest, for the board to do its due diligence anytime there's some concern that's raised by the public.
Well said. Thinking back specifically over your time as leader of the medical board, first as executive director and then as CEO, tell me about a time that was very challenging. What do you think of as one of your greatest challenges that had to be overcome during your time as the medical board's leader?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. One was early on and one was more recently. But, early on, we got sideways with some of our stakeholder organizations. And the reason for that was that I felt, and perhaps others on the staff felt like that we knew best how to regulate the practice of medicine. We were the experts in the area. We really didn't need input from anybody as to how to best go about doing that. And then there were a series of sort of self-inflicted wounds, which were fairly painful. And we kind of learned the hard way that regulation works best when it's a collaborative effort involving all of our important stakeholders. And so once we figured that out, we started not just putting the blinders on, but looking left and right and inviting input into how it is we go about doing our work. That got a lot better. I'm pleased to say that we're in a much better position with that now than we were early on. More recently, one of the biggest challenges we had was COVID-19, the pandemic, having to produce meetings virtually, having to set up an arrangement for our employees to be able to work remotely. We eventually worked through all that, and I think have a lot more options available to us now with our meetings, and with our work than we did before. So it all wound up in a good place. But that was, and I know you remember that time, back in March and April of 2020 and over the next couple of years. And of course, we were also working with state health officials, with regard to vaccines eventually. And so that was a very, very challenging time. I'm glad that's behind us.
I agree. It was challenging. I mean, it was a sort of an unprecedented thing. And, certainly we were not the only organization dealing with this, but it seemed like within a few days' notice, it was apparent that the organization was going to have to go from being mostly everybody working in the office in person to everybody working remotely, and just figuring out how to accomplish that on the fly. What was indeed very challenging. But, I don't know if you feel the same. I also think in a way it was kind of the medical board's finest hour, because everybody from board members on down, the staff really rose to the challenge, in my opinion. Right. And it's always looking back on that time period, I'm pleased to say that it wasn't business as usual, but, the board really kept things going. We never had a period where the board had to cease operations because we just couldn't get the work done. And that is good, to know that even in the midst of very great challenges, not only did the board keep doing its work, it did additional work, because we were standing ready to assist the state with its COVID response in any way we could, and did serve as an important intermediary, getting messages out to our licensees. So I would say I agree it was challenging, but I also think our organization, I hope, did you proud.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we set a record number of special meetings and emergency meetings back then. A lot of that was modifying our rules to adjust to the circumstances, issuing emergency licenses to folks. So everybody stepped up, board members and staff, and I was really proud of how we managed all that.
Yeah, same here. So you may have just answered this next question, but what are you most proud of when you think back on your 20 years in the big seat?
Well, I mean, there are lots of things that we've done over the past 20 plus years that I'm really proud of. I guess thinking about more recently, one of the things that I think of is our work related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Ever since May of 2020, when George Floyd was killed, we've collectively and individually had to sort of look at how it is we do things and make some changes. So I know as an organization, we've been committed to that work. The diversity and inclusion work group was created not too long after that to sort of focus on that issue. We have hired or are close to hiring an outside consultant to take a look at our processes, both licensing and investigative processes, and compare those to some recommendations that came out recently from the Federation of State Medical Boards, and make recommendations as to how it is we might could change things to eliminate as much as possible unconscious bias in the decision-making process. We're encouraging our licensees to do that same sort of inward look in how it is that they go about practicing medicine, becoming more knowledgeable about cultural competency, so that implicit bias is minimized as much as possible in the exam room and in the medical decision-making process. So, and other things we've done, set up annual training for board members and staff, and other things along those lines, again, just to try and address that issue as best we can.
Great. How did you know that it was time to retire?
Well, a couple of things. One, I had a checklist of things I want to do before I retire, so it was probably about a dozen things on there. And, I'm pleased to report that virtually all those things have been accomplished. One of the remaining things is getting the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact enacted. I'm cautiously optimistic we might be able to get that done this legislative session. So the checklist is pretty much completed. And then the other thing is, it was very important to me to set the next person up for success. I've got a lot invested in this organization, and I want it to continue to succeed and do well. And so I wanted to try and time it in a way that the next person would have a great chance of continuing the good work that we've been doing. And so that kind of crystallized for me back in September. Staff had presented a really bold, forward-looking budget to the board, and we had a good discussion at the September meeting about that and what that meant, not just for the short term, but for the long term, for the future of the board. And I was really proud that they did adopt the proposed budget. And it was just the weekend after that meeting, I was feeling really, really good about where the board was and the future of the board. And it just hit me, this is the time. And I met with the president of the board that following Tuesday to let him know my decision. And then I announced it to the staff and the other board members later on that day. So I do feel good about the future of the board. I feel good about getting things to where they are now, but I'm also very optimistic about the future.
Great. I don't want to gloss over the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact, because some people may not be familiar with what that is. Would you just say a few words about what that is and why it might be important for North Carolina to adopt it?
Sure. I mean, it's just like all compacts, states are able to join the compact or not. If adopted in North Carolina, we'd be joining. I think there's already 35 other states that are in it. So it's up and running. It basically provides an alternative pathway. You can still do the traditional licensure process in North Carolina, but if you elect to go through the compact, then it really facilitates getting licensed in all the other member states. So if North Carolina is your state of principal license, you can apply to the compact and say, I want to also be licensed in these 10 other states. And that's pretty much automatically happens as opposed to having to apply in each one of those 10 states, which is the way it was before the compact. So I think it'll really help North Carolina physicians who want to be licensed in other states and practice through telehealth or otherwise in other states. And then I think it'll also help North Carolina patients, because they may have access to more care because physicians who are practicing in other states and who get licensed in North Carolina will be able to provide services.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for the explanation.
Sure.
So what do you think you're going to miss the most about the job?
That's the easiest question you've asked, and that's just the people. I mean, it's just I just can't tell you how fortunate I've been, to get to know some just really great people, board members and staff, current and past. Just again, dedicated public servants working hard to make the world a little bit better place. And so, yeah, getting to see people and work alongside them with the important work that we do, that'll be the thing I'll miss the most.
Well, you will be missed, and I think I've already shared this with you privately, but I'm hoping to put you to work doing outreach presentations from time to time.
Happy to help.
Hopefully you won't be disappearing. So
okay.
You mentioned when thinking about when to retire that one of your goals was to do everything you could to set the next person to lead the board as its CEO, set them up for success. So I wanted to ask you, what would you say to that person? What advice would you give the next CEO of the North Carolina Medical Board?
Well, a couple of things, I guess. One, from a strategic standpoint, we talked about the board's vision to be, proactive and progressive leader in the world of medical regulation. So just continue to stay focused on that vision, to continue to follow that in the work that that person does. That's more the strategy piece of it. And then, from a tactical standpoint, just building on, our continuous improvement model that we talk a lot about. We acknowledge that we're doing a pretty good job with how we go about medical regulation, but we also know that we can constantly do things better, be more effective, more efficient in how it is we go about our work. So yeah, just keep that momentum going, keep that same sort of philosophy and approach to both the strategic and the tactical work.
Okay. And I wanted to end just by asking if you would share with us some of your plans for the future. How are you going to be spending your time?
Well, it's the usual stuff you always hear. I've got a big stack of books at home I've been wanting to get to, and lots of shows that I've bookmarked, to watch, and lots of places I want to go visit. So certainly we'll do that. My parents, they turned 90 recently, and they're here in the Raleigh area, and so I'm looking forward to spending some more time with them. Our grown daughters and their husbands are here in the Raleigh area. Maybe before too long, there might be some grandkids in our future. So I'm looking forward to that. But I've polled recent retirees and to get their advice on things, and they pretty much consistently say you got to stay active mentally and physically in your retirement years, and certainly plan to do that.
That's wonderful. Well, David, on a personal note, you hired me, a little over 15 years ago.
I remember that.
And
one of my better decisions.
Thank you. One of my better ones to accept. It's been an honor and a privilege, and I wish you all the best in future.
Thank you so much, Gene. I really appreciate that. And I hope we have some other opportunities to work together down the line.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for spending some time with me, and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of MedBoard Matters. Thank you for listening. It truly is the end of an era. On a personal note, I want to say thank you, David, for your leadership and for the support and encouragement that you have consistently provided to me and to all the staff. I will miss you. You may have heard the saying that every ending is also a new beginning, and I'm happy to say that the medical board is moving forward with someone who is well positioned to maintain the momentum started under Mr. Henderson's leadership. Chief Legal Officer Tom Mansfield. Mr. Mansfield has led the North Carolina Medical Board's legal department for 21 years and was recently named CEO. He begins the new role on June the 1st. If you'd like to learn more about Mr. Mansfield or Mr. Henderson, head on over to our show page at www.ncmedboard.org/podcast. As always, your comments, questions, and suggestions are appreciated and can be sent to us at podcast@ncmedboard.org. Thanks again for listening. I hope you will join me again.
This podcast is produced by the North Carolina Medical Board.
The North Carolina Medical Board exists for the benefit and protection of the people of North Carolina.